Using Sonar, we can generate configuration files for Mimosa devices, and there's a couple of things that need to be set up to make this work. There's two ways this data gets to your Mimosa devices. One is that the device will request a basic configuration file from Sonar when it first connects to your network. So you need to make sure that your Mimosa devices either have public addresses, or if they have private addresses, they need to be able to get out to the internet by being NATed in order to reach Sonar. And the other way is that they'll pull some data that can be changed in real time from a Radius server, and Mimosa has some documentation on how you need to link this Radius server up to your access points. The only thing you need to make sure of in Sonar is that you have a Radius server linked into network and then Radius server, and we do have a tool on our GitHub called Free Radius Genie that can set up a free Radius server for you if you'd like. If you have an existing server, there is some config you need to do to make this work, so check with Mimosa. They should have some documentation for you on what needs to be done to make the Radius piece work. So inside Sonar, once you have your Radius server linked up, what we need to do is some basic config here in order to build the data that we want to include in these config files. So we want to make sure this is enabled. If it's disabled, then we will no longer serve the config file and we won't update Radius. And then there's a variety of options to pick here. We can enforce a firmware version. If this is checked, then if the device that is connecting to your network, the Mimosa radio, the CPE, is not of the version entered here, then we will go to this URL to download the new firmware and push it to the CPE. So you'll want to have some kind of system set up inside your network to serve this firmware. It can be an HTTP server, HTTPS, TFTP, or FTP server. We want to pick the wireless MAC protocol, and the things that you'll see here are just the basic settings that we have inside the Mimosa CPE. So if you don't want these on auto, you would just pick whatever setting you want to use, and that would be included in the config file. When we build a config file, there's two options for the management IP on a radio. It can be given out by DHCP, which is what it will be by default, or we can give a static address. So by default, this config file will say that the management IP is dynamic and it's served by DHCP. If you want it to be static, what you would do is you would add the Mimosa radio to an account, and then you would bind the specific IP that you want to the MAC address of the radio, and I'll show you that here in a second. But you'd bind that IP to the radio, and then in the config file we would instead put a static assignment in there. If we do a static assignment, the DNS servers entered here are the DNS servers that will give the radio to use. If you're going to do it dynamically, then these DNS servers will be ignored. If you're using a special management VLAN, you would check this box here, and then you would enter the management VLAN you want to use here. Mine's set to 100. You would enter whatever you want. This is the HTTP port that the CPE is available on. If you want to enable HTTPS, you can check this box and again define the port here. So let's say we wanted instead management HTTP to be on 8080 and we wanted the HTTPS to be on 4443. We could change that here. Mimosa has a cloud management system. We can enable access to that or not, and we can set the password to log into the device here. Do we want to enable Snmp or not? If we do, what's the community string we want to use? And if you have a trap server, what's the IP of the trap server? What do we want to use for an NTP host? And then if we want remote syslog, we can figure that here. So hopefully these are pretty self-explanatory. By running through those, hopefully those all make sense. Once you've set these up to your liking, you just hit save down at the bottom here, and that config will be saved. And anytime you make changes here, if you have existing devices that are being managed through Sonar, we'll update those Radius attributes and we'll update the flat file in real time to be pulled on next reboot. Next stage we need to do is to go through the inventory models here. So what you need to do for this to work is you have to have your Mimosa CPE entered as an inventory model in Sonar, and it must have at least two fields, one of which must be a MAC address field. And the reason that we need this is when the CPE goes out to the Radius server, it uses a combination of the serial number and the MAC address as the username and password. So what you have to do here is check the models that are your Mimosa gear. I have a Mimosa C5 checked here, and I'm saying the serial number field that I have is the serial number, and the MAC address field I have is the MAC address. So you just need to make sure that you pick the correct fields here, the serial number and the MAC address field, and you need to make sure that you're inventorying the management MAC of the radio as well as the serial number on the radio. So once this is all set up, the last thing we would do is hit synchronize Sonar data to Radius server up at the top here. That'll go to your Radius server if this is the first time you've set this up, and add any usernames and passwords that we need for the models, as well as writing all the Radius attributes, and then you should be good to go.